Ali, Hafade, Yakwe, Rananim, to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our second for the Future Strategies for Sustainable Micronesia webinar. Today, we are very fortunate and lucky to have Dr. Charles Fletcher and Dr. J. Scott Hauger with us to talk about climate change as a national security issue. It's kind of wonderful as being a part of IPIKU to report who's been subscribing or signing up for these. Everywhere from the East Coast to different universities to Canada to all of Micronesia represented. We're very delighted to be able to share this and showcase our host for today. If I may, I'm going to share just a bit about IPIKU, who is primarily sponsoring these programs. So IPIKU is the Indigenous Pacific Islands Knowledge Universe, and the motivation behind what we do is building a Pacific partnership, really to better the quality of life for our communities in Micronesia. We have at that the purpose to enable existing working group of Micronesian scholars, elevate their work, elevate issues around the community. Issues that scholars and Indigenous leaders would like to see at the forefront, especially as we wrestle with so many global phenomena here in the Pacific and in Micronesia. Give you a quick flavor about who is in the organization. You'll see here former Minister of State Faustina Marug, Dr. Liz Rehabe, Frank Rabaliman from the CNMI, both from the CNMI, Dr. Cecilia Salvatore, who is originally from the CNMI, currently a professor at Chicago, Zita Pangilinan, who's from the island of Guam, Gardini Isaac, who is currently the Minister of Education over the Federated States of Micronesia, Margarita Cholome, again, also from FSM. And last two of our leaders are Dr. Hilda Heine, and Marie Madison from the Marshall Islands. This all started organically. Many of them, really choosing to lead and collaborate and get together to try and elevate, important issues for Micronesia. We just go back to here. What we're going to do today for our session is we're going to have a quick, short reflection from both of our speakers, Dr. Chip Fletcher and Dr. J. Scott Hauger. And after that, we'll have a Q&A. The Q&A will be initially kicked off by some students. And after that, we'll open it up broadly to the forum and to the panelists. So if you have any questions at any time, there is a Q&A button on the very bottom. Please feel free to go ahead and drop your questions in there, and we'll try to get to them in due time. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask one of our, former, alum, actually from the University of Pittsburgh, who's been who's worked and talked to a bunch of you, to go ahead and introduce Dr. Chip Fletcher. Here he is. He's just being promoted to a panelist. Give the delay here. All right. Oh, turns out I just got a message. He's unable to do it. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Fletcher. So Dr. Charles Chip Fletcher is the interim dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He's chairperson of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission, prominent public speaker, and a contributor definitely to the local and national media. Dr. Fletcher's research and teaching focus on climate change, coastal community resilience, and natural coastal systems are one of the reasons we invited him here. He's been a principal advisor in funding and awarding over 30 graduate research degrees in earth and planetary sciences, and has received a number of teaching, research, and community service awards. We do know that you act in several capacities and have engaged many of our leaders in the Pacific as well. A couple of things I would like to point out: in 2011, You won the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Achievement Award in Climate Change Science. And then another award was in 2018, the Pacific Risk Management Ohana Leadership Award. So the results of his work are used by government agencies for administering coastal policy, establishing construction guidelines, and planning resilient infrastructure projects. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for being here. And I think I'll hand off the reins to you first.
Thank you, David. Thanks everybody for being here today. This is a critically important topic, as everybody here realizes. I thought I would begin by sort of painting a picture of what is our temperature pathway at this stage. Most of you have no doubt seen the third volume of the assessment report 6 from the IPCC was just released. And it continues to paint a very bleak picture. The quotes that come from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he continues to find new ways to express his disappointment and all of our disappointment. He refers to this new volume as a file of shame, cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. So what does this mean exactly? At the last Conference of Parties in Glasgow, Scotland last November, a new round of pledges from the world's nations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change updated the temperature trajectory of our greenhouse gas emissions. Those most recent pledges put us on a pathway of net warming of 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. However, there's a difference between the promises that the world's nations make and the actual policies that they're investing in terms of permitting and building new fossil fuel infrastructure. And when you examine the announced policies nation by nation, it turns out that they are not, many nations are not holding to their promises. And we're actually on a pathway more like 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, we have to add to that the fact that the Washington Post released a study during the Glasgow meeting that on average, greenhouse gas emissions are underreported by 23%. So here we are finding a disparity between national policies and national promises. And on top of that, the inventory or the cataloging of greenhouse gas emissions is not accurate. And we learned about a month ago from the International Energy Agency that methane emissions alone are underreported by 70%. Now, none of these are taken into account in the national pledges in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change projections for warming. We don't hear about them. They aren't modeled. They aren't taken into account. And so the truth is that we are on a much hotter pathway than the general media reveal. But the bad news doesn't stop there. On average, every year, about 1/3 of our carbon dioxide emissions are taken up by photosynthesis by land plants, the continental or terrestrial biome. Well, photosynthesis has a thermal maximum. And as the temperature rises, photosynthesis rapidly decreases and plants instead engage in accelerated respiration. Respiration is when plants actually release carbon dioxide to the air. And an example of this can be seen in the Amazon rainforest. More than half of the world's rainforest is located in the Amazon basin. And over the last decade, from 2010 to 2019, the rainforest released 18 billion tons of carbon dioxide, but only absorbed 15 billion tons. And a report, in fact, just came out last week showing that 17% of the Amazon has been destroyed between mining, hunting, wildfire, deforestation for agriculture, the damming of rivers. We have seen over the last decade the loss of 1/3 of all biomass in the Amazon basin. And overall, globally, the tropical rainforests of the world have doubled the amount of carbon that they release to the atmosphere. 20 years ago, at the turn of this century, they released an average of 0.9 billion tons of CO2 per year. And the most recent assessment is that the rainforests of the world are releasing 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year now. And the reason, among other reasons, this is such bad news is that it means that our attempts to stop deforestation are failing. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with rapidly melting ice sheets, rapidly thermally expanding ocean waters. In fact, the first report back in August of 2021 under the current IPCC triplet of reports reiterated for us what we had learned already, is that thermal expansion is going to continue to raise sea level for over 1,000 years. And as the warm surface waters are cycled down to the abyss, as they're cycled down into the deeper portions of the water column, thermal expansion will be taking place throughout the entire water column of the ocean. So sea level rise is a given background condition now. It is not something that is a crisis. It is an unstoppable background fundamental condition for which we must plan. Now, it is a crisis in the sense that we're not ready for it, and none of our coastal management policies and efforts have been designed for sea level rise. We're scrambling as fast as we can around the world in coastal communities to adjust our planning, to redesign our communities, and to look at creative ways of learning to live with water. And especially in Micronesia, this is an absolute imperative. But we cannot look at sea level rise as something that we're going to solve or get past. It is going to be unstoppable, and we need to think very long term, but act immediately if we're going to continue to live in these mid-ocean locations, which I would propose, and I know many of you would agree with me. Climate migration is just not an option. It's really it's unethical when you hear continental nations of the world propose that climate migration is an adaptation solution. That's an unethical, in fact, it's an immoral statement for them to make that. Our communities are place-based communities, and our place is in the ocean, in the Pacific, on these islands, and we need to figure out how to learn to live with water. So I'll end with that, and I want to thank you for your time and attention. I'll be looking forward to the words from Scott Hauger and also to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. Again, a reminder for those who have questions, we'll have the Q&A shortly right after this, kicking it off first with some of the student questions. Allow me to introduce Dr. J. Scott Hauger, who has a 45-year career as a researcher, teacher, and program manager and entrepreneur in areas related to science, technology, and policy. For the last 15 years, his work is centered on issues of climate change and environmental security, with a focus on the Indo-Pacific region. He brings to the field advanced degrees in both natural sciences and social sciences, with a doctorate in science and technology studies. Dr. Hauger founded Climate and Environmental Security LLC to provide a vehicle for collaborative research and consulting after he retired last June as a professor of environmental security at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. From 2004 to 2009, he has served as a research professor and vice president for government and business relations at Nevada's Desert Research Institute, where he was responsible for the oversight of an international research portfolio. Prior to joining DRI, Dr. Hauger served as the Director of Science and Engineering Policy and Practice Group of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as a faculty member and founder of the STS Branch Graduate Program at Virginia Tech's Northern Virginia Graduate Center, and as the founder and CEO of Applied Concepts Corporation, all providing technology assessment, technology development services, including around renewable energy and technology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. J. Scott Hauger.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. That's a terrific introduction, but you make me feel old. Does the screen come up? Are we?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's not yet in full
Let
screen.
me go to full screen. And we should be ready to go.
We are good. Yes.
Okay. Well, there you go. I gave a great deal of thought to putting this presentation together because I was stuck between the horns of a dilemma, namely trying to, all problems or all solutions are local, if you will, but our knowledge on climate change is global. It's at the 40,000 foot place. And I figured that my audience today certainly knows much, much more about the local situation than I ever could. And I'm afraid you probably know as much about the global situation as I do too. So what I thought I would try to do is to add some value to the discussion by trying to be integrative over science and policy fields, and to provide maybe some conceptual basis at the nexus of science, technology, and society. So this is the bottom line. I'm working in a military organization, or for a military organization, independent consultant, working for the Center for Excellence in Disaster Management's Indo-PACOM's new climate change impacts problem. So as a military guy now, I have to give a bottom line up front for a presentation. Here's what I'm going to try and cover today, very briefly in each step. First, to remind you that climate change is a complex and emergent phenomenon, and that it's emerging in a context of legacy institutions for governance, institutions that weren't designed to address climate change. They were designed to address other problems, and yet they're the ones that we have to deal with. As you know, Micronesian states are highly vulnerable to the existential and contingent threats of climate change. And those threats are currently being re-engaged under the Biden administration by the US security sector, which is working to understand its role in a whole of government and whole of society context. So we're inventing as we're going along here. And as a consequence, the timely opportunity exists for Micronesian and other Pacific Island governments to influence US and global management of security. So yeah, the bad news is there, as Dr. Fletcher said, that's for sure. But if we look at management, we have a window of opportunity at the moment because of the overall political situation that we may be able to take advantage of. And I'm going to try and deal with those topics with 5 bullets here. First, trends and complexity of climate change. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Basically, what it says is greenhouse gas emissions have been going up for 100 years, and they're going up faster and faster all the time. And as a consequence, global temperatures are rising, air and sea temperatures. And these are observable facts. There's no question about them. There they are, okay? But it's taking place in a complex environment of society. Climate change is the poster child for complexity. I stole this map from a professor named Fridtjof Capra, who's essentially, he does development, that's what he does. But it struck me that this really showed some of the interactions. It's like a causal loop diagram with climate change smack in the middle between all the development factors, population growth, economic growth, climate refugees, ultimately potentially failing states. And so when we go to address these issues of the impacts of climate change, we're in a situation where anything that we attempt to do is going to have unintended consequences, i.e. it's going to jiggle something else in this complex decision arena. In fact, I'm calling it climate space, in this complex climate space. And the solutions are not to be found in silos, in disciplinary silos or sectoral silos or scale silos, which provides a new kind of challenge to governance that it's up to you to solve. It's up to us to solve. If we don't solve it, it won't be solved, and all those worst scenarios that Dr. Fletcher was describing will happen. Part of that context is the emerging understanding of the relationship between sustainable development and security. And I take this little quote from the Sustainable Development Program. The 2030 Agenda recognizes that sustainable development is intertwined with peace and security, each incapable of being achieved without the other. Well, I come from the security side of that, not from the development side of it. But in fact, this is part of that complexity of climate change. It's a climate space that means we're going to have to develop new institutions and new attitudes in order to manage the problems that face us. Okay, and indeed, speaking of governments, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the climate governance now occurs in legacy institutions, institutions that were developed at least over the last 50 years, sometimes back to time immemorial, to handle traditional security problems, such as the United Nations system with its General Assembly and Security Council, where any of 5 nations can veto decisions made on a global problem, and do, okay? In a geopolitical context, where vested interests, economic interests in fossil fuel production and use have their interests that cross national interests and policies, and also in the context that's particularly appropriate, I think, to Micronesia, of US and Chinese rivalry for supremacy in the Asia-Pacific region. And at the regional level, governance depends on national politics and participation, and on competing organizations, at least in the Pacific area, where there are a variety of organizations and potential splits in the primary organization for governance legacy system. They weren't set up to do climate change. That's what they have to do now. That's their job. They're doing it. They're struggling to do it because I think they were designed to solve other problems. And at the national level, there's always national political context, different relations with larger nations, and the question that I've been dealing with, and in fact, departments of defense, ministries of defense all over the world are dealing with, what is the role of the military in climate security? One of our students just said to us last week when we presented some of this information, this is not my job. My job's to fight. Okay, well, that's what your job was 50 years ago. It's not what your job is going to be in the near future. So the statement, to summarize this, the statement of the problem is this: climate change is an emergent, existential security threat brought about by human action of a kind not previously encountered in human history. Inputs, greenhouse gases, are current, but the outputs are cumulative. As Dr. Fletcher pointed out, and impacts emerge over time. In other words, it's a chronic problem, not an acute problem. And when the security sector has an acute problem, like say Russia invading Ukraine, that's going to have their primary attention because the other stuff's only going to impact so strongly in the future. We have imperfect human institutions to manage these security threats that were developed to respond to different threats. And so there's a mismatch between security institutions' historical missions, organizations and capabilities, and the nature of the emerging threats. I'll just remind you of what you already know, that all of this impacts Micronesia directly in a variety of ways, but 3 of the most important are that warming oceans and increasing acidity lead to a projected decline in fisheries for the rest of the century. And at the same time, the rate of sea level rise is increasing infrastructure and sustainability degradation on atoll and coastal areas, while at the same time, cyclonic wind speeds are increasing and precipitation is increasing. That's because in a warmer atmosphere, more water evaporates from the ocean into the air. What goes up must come down. These have all been increasing with additional impacts. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, these trends will continue at a pace dependent on the future rate of global carbon emissions. Okay, I just want to point out the connection between climate impacts on the one hand and security impacts on the other, because this isn't always clear to professionals in the security sector. The climate impacts we just talked about, rising sea levels, the cyclones, flood. And as you know, they impact directly on our nation's freshwater access, food production, infrastructure, potential for disease outbreak, and high possibilities of migration because of these other things. But that in turn leads to an increasing need for HADR, with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which is a recognized role for security sector, to potential conflict over resources. Fisheries, for example, as fisheries become more limited, who gets to fish? Who gets to get licenses? Does it go to local? Does it go to China? Does it go to the US, Taiwan? Let's see, increased stress on weak governments that have to deal with those problems, and then an existential threat for coastal cities and atoll nations. Oops, I wanted to point out, I'm getting problems connecting here. Okay, I wanted to point out that the security sector is beginning to take note of this. This is a chart from the National Intelligence Council, a national intelligence estimate from last year. I put some blue arrows at those that are of particular importance to Micronesia. But again, the security sector is saying, okay, we should be concerned about developing countries' demands for technical assistance, about cross-border migration, negative health consequences, internal insecurity and conflict. And as you see from the little faces on the right, all projected to increase in the course of the next 20 years. So the US government at least is taking notice. I don't know why I'm having trouble. There we go. And this specifically, I mentioned that I'm a senior advisor to the climate impacts program that INDOPACOM, US INDOPACOM, has set up in its Center for Excellence for Disaster Management. This is one of their first products in which they've been trying to do a risk assessment across the various regions that they're responsible. And as you can see, they're looking specifically at Micronesia, among other, asking what the impacts are, asking what the expectations are, and doing this as a first step toward being able to inform the commander of INDOPACOM of what he may be facing and what he may have to face, which the commander is interested in, because in January, President Biden, a year ago, President Biden issued Executive Order 14,008, which says this is going to be the key element of US foreign policy. Okay, and then in the geopolitical context, we have a high ambiguity. This quote is from the recent agreement between the US and China in 2021 that said the US and China are committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis, which must be addressed with the serious and urgency that it demands. This includes both enhancing their respective actions and cooperating in multilateral processes. So there's an opportunity for collaboration here. In fact, I should point out that I personally do research and have throughout the Trump administration and before with the Chinese Academy of Sciences on climate change issues. So this has been going on in the background for some time and is being brought to the surface again under the new administration. But it's not as simple as that. This was just very recent in February. A quote from the Chinese international newspaper says, in terms of climate response, officials from Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, and other countries have previously said that the US was not competent enough to deal with the increasing threat of climate change and thus turned to China for help. Okay, the US strengthens its ties with Pacific nations with a very strong motivation to maintain its hegemony. This doesn't sound exactly like cooperation, so it's going to be a ambiguous approach, in that geopolitical context between the US and China, and thus an opportunity for Micronesia. What do we do about it? Okay, you can take the old, very familiar disaster management cycle of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, and apply it to the climate change situation, where mitigation means managing atmospheric greenhouse gases. That's been the main thrust of the UNFCCC, the Paris Accords, and so on. Not the only thrust, but the main thrust. As you know, Pacific Island nations have negligible contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore not only not responsible while being the recipients of the outcome, but it's their main possible area for management is managing the big countries, political management of the big countries to achieve their ends. Second is preparedness, which right now means if you can't mitigate it, you're going to have to adapt to it. So preparedness is adaptation. And response, well, where mitigation fails, adaptation fails, we're going to have to respond. And it's the security sector that's going to have to respond. And then, if that doesn't work, recovery. But with climate change, recovery may be unattainable. Going back to the status quo is basically impossible. So there's the bad news to complement Dr. Fletcher's bad news. And yet, these are the areas that we have to work on. So I use the concept of climate space for talking about those. You're familiar with cyberspace, and it's just as much a metaphor as climate space is. There is no space, but it's a mental space, a conceptual space for framing these complex issues of climate change and security. That multidimensional domain where nature, geography, human economic and industrial activities, geoscience, climate research, local and global politics all interact, remember my big spaghetti diagram, to impact human security and thus regional and global security. So what are the possibilities within that? Well, again, we can talk about different scenarios of, you know, where we put our capital, where we put our political capital, our economic capital in our efforts to manage these threats. Some scenarios are mitigation scenarios where we reduce carbon emissions, maybe absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, reforestation. Under these scenarios, we reduce the threat by reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Can we do it? Very questionable, but doing it requires global collaboration and technological change by major powers. It's the US, China, Russia, India, European Union that are going to have to do this, okay, if it can be done. Adaptation scenarios, though, must largely be at the national and subnational level. If you're going to build a seawall, if you're going to raise the level of your town or what have you, you got to do it locally. And you got to come up with the resources at the local level. They needn't all be local resources, but they have to be managed at that local level. And in order to do that, Micronesian countries need knowledge and they need financial resources from the larger countries. So it's also a likely domain for geopolitical competition and an area for potential exploitation. You can picture China saying, hey, take my Belt and Road Initiative and apply it and use it to achieve your goals. And USA, nah, don't do that. You need USAID to come in and help you. They can be worked off one against the other. Response scenarios where neither of those two are working don't reduce or address the underlying problem. They just go and do a local fix, an immediate fix of some sort or another. Nonetheless, I mean, if you've just suffered 3 major typhoons in a month, it will benefit you to get international response to help you. So pre-preparing, pre-planning, pre-positioning response scenarios is a benefit. And I'll remind you, there's always the do-nothing scenario. But the do-nothing scenario here results in catastrophic consequences for the Micronesian countries. There's currently some opportunities to take advantage of international situation in this help. Under the Biden administration, the US is proactively looking to take a leadership role on the climate change issues. That's why I have a job right now, because they've hired me to help them with that. Every agency in the Department of Defense, every agency in the US government is considering and working on these issues right now, looking for the places to spend their money. Okay, and it's getting to be too late. It's now the time to get in there with proposals, good ideas that can attract those agencies. So there's the opportunity to reach out to those agencies with proposals for cooperative ventures. What can we do about it? Take advantage of that opportunity. As part of the process of resecuritization of climate change under the Biden administration, there's also a need for the US to discuss and seek consensus among allies and partner nations. The agencies recognize that they don't have all the answers. They emphasize partnering with other nations. I think they're unusually receptive right now, and the opportunity exists to exploit that situation again. And I think, it's my own opinion, that these initiatives will have cross-administration longevity. I think even if a Republican administration replaces the current administration, that over the last 4 to 8 years, the situation has become obvious, that agencies have developed the perspective. The language we use may change. We may not call it climate change. We may call it adaptation to sea level rise or something else. But the will is going to continue even if administrations change. So here's my summary, my bottom line up front. Climate change is a complex and emergent phenomenon. It's emerging in a context of legacy institutions for governance. Micronesian states are highly vulnerable to existential and contingent threats. Those threats are currently being re-engaged by the US security sector, which is working to understand its role in a whole of government, whole of society context. And therefore, a timely opportunity exists for Micronesian and Pacific Island governments, international organizations, and NCOs to influence US and global management of climate security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hauger. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick off the Q&A. I'm going to start with actually some students who have prepared some questions beforehand and allow them to voice their questions and direct them to either of you. For those others in the audience who would like to ask their questions, please go ahead and use the chat or the Q&A, the Q&A button on the very bottom. I'm going to start with Natalie here, and just allow her to talk and ask her question.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my question has to do a little bit with sea level rise, and I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, keeping in mind that people don't want to leave their homes and their islands, and they don't want to be climate refugees. I was just hoping to hear a little bit more about maybe the complications of protecting islands from sea level rise, whether that be like cultural or political or something to do with like land ownership rights and things like that. And then maybe solutions that you've seen or could envision to help, work with that and keep people on their home islands.
Please go first.
Who was that for?
I think Natalie, I think it might have been for both of you, but we can start with you, Dr. Fletcher.
Yeah, great question. Very comprehensive question. Land ownership issues are very complex. Just taking the Marshall Islands, for instance, my understanding is that there's no such thing as public land, that actually the government buildings and institutions are leasing land from the owners of the land. I even have personal experience in getting permission to work on one of the islands in the Majuro Atoll that there were multiple owners. Government records were not clear, and people actually, families showed up as we were working out there, telling us that we were on their land. So ownership is huge. What can community response be? Well, I think there are staged responses at different time scales. I think an immediate response is to employ nature-based solutions such as mangroves, dune building, beach renourishment, in reaction to both coastal erosion and to high wave run-up, which is occurring with greater and greater frequency. Nature-based solutions do many things. They spread the word among a community that this is a concern, an urgent matter. They give us something to do, which is so important for the human psychology, that there is something we can do. On the sort of intermediate time scale of around mid-century, we're probably looking on the order of about 1 foot of sea level rise. But if you add a king tide on top of that, then we're getting up to 2 feet of sea level rise. If it happens to rain hard, then you're looking at flooding equivalent to 2.5 to 3 feet of sea level rise for a few hours. So 1 foot of sea level rise brings with it the possibility of much worse flooding than a simple 1 foot. And if you look to the Maldives, you find that the national policy in the Maldives is actually to bring in their outer communities, and they are dredging the shallow water sand and gravel, and they are building new islands. And they've built a extremely large new island on which they are building smart communities where you have ground floor commercial walkable communities with the upper 2 or 3 floors as livable apartments and condominiums. They have an open area which they're hoping some major university steps in and builds a campus there. They have a stadium. This is really quite an amazing complex. I think it's called Hulhulmale, and it is right next. It's simply a simple bridge over from Male, which is their capital city. Unfortunately, having visited there, I can tell you they didn't raise it high enough. They needed to build an island that is at least 2 meters and ideally 3 or 4 meters above high tide, and theirs is only about 1 meter above high tide. So during high tide, when you look at the excavations of where they're putting in new apartment buildings, you see the water table right there. So they're only about 2 feet away from already flooding their brand new island. And they are looking in other areas at floating cities inside the confined quiet waters of a atoll lagoon. They're designing floating components that was sort of fit together like jigsaw puzzles. There's dwelling on there. You can ride bikes. You can walk around. There are commercial districts. All of this floating in the quiet water of a lagoon. So these are the sorts of staged and very clever and creative approaches that I think are going to be necessary. With regard to land ownership, if you get off the current land and you build some new land, you don't have those problems, or you create a floating community or some combination. Yes, in dredging and building new islands, there is going to be coral reef damage, but I think there is a cost-benefit analysis that goes with this. If you do an analysis of where are traditional fishing grounds, where are the sand and gravel resources, where are the culturally important locations, and isolate where you get your sand and gravel and where you build a new island, or where you raise an existing island or expand an existing island. I think there can be smart choices there to minimize environmental damage. But we are talking about preserving a culture. And lastly, on the high islands, so sort of Ponape, Chuk, Yap, that sort of thing, islands like that, it may appear that you can retreat up to the steeper portions of the watershed, but in fact, the slopes there are very unstable. It's really not very common to find higher elevation areas that can be easily turned into new communities. And regardless of that, all of our communities rely on shipping. So those ports are the key thing. And I can tell you that the the Honolulu commercial port, which is the lifeline for the island, the community of Hawaii. The Honolulu commercial port has just gone through a 3 or 4 year long consultant analysis where they are going to raise it about 1 meter. They're going to raise it 3 feet. And that means raising all the bulkheads and the docks. And they're also raising the roads so that there's access for the shipping, the container trucking to come and go from the port. So this is about adaptation, and there are multiple ways to achieve that, to stay in place. How do we fund this? I think negotiations with the U.S. for under the Compact of Free Association ought to ask for some of the funding that would pay for this. But there's also green investment opportunities, green shipping, tuna, green ports. All of these are opportunities for the investment world to assist with the cost associated with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. Dr. Hauger, would you like to add anything?
I would agree with everything that you said. Is it Chip? May I call you Chip?
Absolutely, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with everything that you said. I would add a couple of, just general political cautions or concerns, and that is the technical contingencies and of sea level rise and when it stops. I mean, if you build for 1 meter increase, well, what if we go to 2 meters? And when will we go to 2 meters? And it all depends upon actions taking back in those other sectors 20 years before in order to predict what the time frame and timeline may have. We can do scenarios pretty well, but we don't know when those events that are critical to those scenarios may occur or what political decisions may occur to advance them. So somehow or another, we need to take those contingencies and costs into account when planning these. Funding, yeah, that's a major problem. We're not talking minor investments here for some of the civil engineering types of approaches to sea level rise. I point out that the military has deep pockets, and one of the things that the military is looking for right now is the availability of airports and ports for conducting their operations, both humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, which they project to increase over the future, but which require moving goods and people and troops and supplies from either pre-positioned places or the continental United States to the places where they're needed, which requires airports and ports, which may become flooded. So they have a vested interest and funding available for addressing those kinds of issues. It's an area where perhaps joint partnerships for cross-sectoral partnerships should be approached and planned, because these are generally dual-use facilities in the island nations. Maybe the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative provides some sort of a prospect for such things. But in looking at funding, it's beyond the scope, I think, of most nations. Compact states, yes, take advantage of the renegotiation to get it included. It's to the advantage of the U.S. security sector to do so.
Thank you so much. Before I call on the next student, I'm actually going to go ahead and I think it's quite timely. This next question is in the Q&A. You can see it. It's from Desmond Dolatrum, who's a social science instructor at the College of Marshall Islands and a PhD candidate in Pacific Studies at the University of South Pacific. The question, do you think Micronesian nations such as the Marshall Islands should wait on developing countries, mitigation efforts, and donor funding, or should be mindful of the time and adapt the cost of consequences, to their natural environment now? You can see the latter part, what he's truly asking is, given the loss of time, and these concerns, how do you manage that tension? So, whoever would like to take that. I don't know that.
No, I don't think we can afford to wait. I'm sure we both have comments there. I don't think we can afford to wait. In fact, we've waited too long. The series of ice streams in West Antarctica are a major threat. We're looking at Thwaites and Pine Island glaciers as accelerating. They're showing new fracture patterns. They're tearing away from their bedrock walls and they're flowing into the ocean in an accelerated way. We just saw a floating ice shelf at the Hauger Glacier collapse. It's the first time that we've had a floating ice shelf in West Antarctica collapse. We've had them collapse up in the warmer water of the Antarctic Peninsula, but this most recent one 2 weeks ago is down in the colder water adjacent to the main continent itself. So this is just the most recent of a whole series of sort of red flags that the rate of sea level rise is very likely, in my mind, to exceed the modeled projections that we're getting from IPCC and from others. And I think scenario planning is an important way to do this. The NASA and NOAA just issued a new report providing new scenarios for planning on sea level rise. I think their intermediate high scenario is a safe one. It projects 1 foot by mid-century, and it also is tied to the tide gauges, and there's a tide gauge in Majuro. And so the specific geophysical issues that means sea level rise in Majuro is going to be different than sea level rise in Honolulu and in Boston, for instance. Those are taken into account by NASA and NOAA. They've modeled those differences. And so we have very realistic assessments and scenarios with which to base our planning. And we can incrementally do our engineering. We don't need to immediately build to 2 meters or more. We can design so that we incrementally add, and this gives us a more affordable approach to the problem. But yes, the answer in my mind is that we've already waited too long and we need to move quickly.
Right. Dr. Hauger?
I agree, and especially with the incrementalism approach. There are, and it again depends upon the local situation, near-term steps that one can take that are not so expensive as some of the long-term, for example, raising the entire port by 3 feet steps, and they can be staged. Chip noted investment in mangrove protection and in working against reef erosion. There have even been some reports that indicate there's going to be some, at least for some reefs in some places, natural buildup of the reef that is faster than sea level rise. But that has been a general study, not really locally applied, but doing those local studies is a quick term to decide where to put your near-term investments. So I would say, pulling in smarts from the research sector, both locally and from the mainland, to address those specific problems of what can be done in the near term, relatively inexpensive as a first step, while planning second steps and third steps. Because again, as Chip pointed out in his first presentation, sea levels are going to continue to rise. We're going to have to protect against 1 foot soon, 2 foot later, 3 feet after, and according to some projections, maybe 60 feet over the course of centuries.
Fantastic. Right. I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of the other questions from the Q&A and then jump back to the students right after that. This next one has to do with ethical issues and responsibility. Given that the ethical issue is probably that some of these solutions really depend on countries that are mainly responsible, for climate change. Maybe your thoughts on how does this work, or how do you elevate it, given current events and the agendas of powerful nations across the globe? I know, an easy question, I'm sure, but a very important one.
I think that the courts of the polluting nations are the venue where the small island developing states should take their case. So more and more lawsuits are being filed against the oil giants. There are lots of failures so far, but there are some minor successes. There's been more success on the international level than the U.S. national level. But in preparation for suing the polluting nations, the Pacific Island nations need to be sure that their legal framework allows it. And so maybe the first thing to do is have a legal analysis of the set of laws and policies that your constitutions or that your legislatures have put in place, and maybe adjust them, strengthen them, so that then in several years you have the basis for taking the polluting nations to court. That's just one thought that I think is a powerful tool that is currently underutilized.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hauger?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. This is a complicated question. It leads to a related question, and that is that the current structure of CLOS, the law of the sea, isn't really geared toward addressing the losses due to climate change. And in fact, they exacerbate it. As far as my understanding, and those of the legal folks that I've asked, is that right now, if you lose your land, you lose your EEZ as well, because the requirements of the law of the sea as written requires you to have land above water, it means high tide, and you draw your land, your zones in such and such a way out to 200 miles under those circumstances, and it's going to require a change in that compact in order to protect the interests of low-lying islands. So that leads to the question, legal remedies, but generally in areas you have to prove intent. And for developed countries, at least up until recent times, proving intent to harm because of carbon emissions is going to be difficult. The US, Europe developed using coal and didn't even know harm was occurring of that sort, let alone to have intent. You can probably make a case against oil companies over the last maybe 20 years since the Rio conference. But the question is, will you have standing in the courts that are going to try it, and what courts might those be? I'm not suggesting this is hopeless, but I do think it's extremely complex and is going to depend on extremely good lawyering, which is going to be extremely expensive. Far better perhaps to try and settle those issues in the political arena. But you framed it as an ethical issue, and I don't think nations and large companies are being very ethical right now. I haven't noticed, for example, Russia taking ethical responsibilities for their actions in Ukraine. To the contrary, they deny it. I think the same thing is likely if you try and hold, for example, China, which has been the major polluter now for going on 10 years in the world, that your chances of getting an ethical response from, oh, yes, this was our fault, we're so sad, we will make up for it by doing this, that, and the other thing. I think this is a toughie. I wouldn't give up. It's an ethical problem. It's true. We need to address it in both political and legal arenas. But I'm not sure how we frame it to get things done.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and allow one of the students to go ahead and ask their next question. And here you go. Nathaniel, can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you for both presenting, both really interesting topics. My question is for Dr. Hauger and also Dr. Fletcher, you, if you want to give your thoughts as well. What I'm asking is, what do you think the future in terms of U.S. military presence in Micronesia looks like, given the geopolitical tensions with China, and how does that play in with the Compact Agreement Association?
Oh boy, yeah. It's a good question and a complicated question and a contingent question. And any answer that I give is going to be limited by my personal perspective and personal knowledge. I have no in to the discussions up in the J2 or J3 branch of US Indo-PACOM, so you needn't worry about me trying to answer for the US government. I don't know. But nonetheless, we seem to, personal opinion now, we seem to have decided that we are going to strategically compete with China for influence in the Pacific. I'm not sure that's a great idea, but that's our posture. And it's got historical roots. We seem to need an adversary in our international relations. And if the Soviet Union falls, then you're probably too young to remember, but we tried to turn Japan into an adversary after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the economic competition for superiority, Japan and the US, well, it didn't work. But at the moment, China bears that burden, rightly or wrongly, and China's stepping up to the plate. They're taking aggressive moves to assert their interests and needs across the Pacific. And you can bet, to the extent that they do so, the US will respond. And they'll respond to promote their interests in the Pacific. So I would say that yes, the US is going to be interested in, well, they'll deny it. They won't use the word, but containment. They'll be interested in containing China and Chinese expansion and influence, and maintaining US influence across the Pacific. They think in terms of hegemony. I don't think that's a necessary approach, but I think that is the realistic geopolitical approach on behalf of both nations. So I think that's the context we're going to be working in.
Dr. Fletcher, any comments?
Oh, I can't add anything intelligent to that. That was a great answer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathaniel.
Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and take this one from the Q&A, and then I'll hop over to Tori and another student. What types and levels of expertise do we need to have in place to truly address sea level rise impact and adaptation needs, for atolls? Perhaps Dr. Fletcher, you might want to start, given that you suggested a few that might be there, but for executing these, what kind of leadership and bandwidth do you need?
Yeah, well, in addition to what has already been mentioned, it's important to point out that the water table under the land goes up and down with the tides in the ocean. And the further away you are from the shoreline, there's a time delay in the water table response to the ocean tides, just as the tides in the atoll lagoon are different than in the open ocean. There's a delay. Atoll islands especially have very thin freshwater aquifers, which are provided only by rain. And as the water table goes up, these freshwater aquifers will rise and they will break out on the land and form wetlands. And we have lots of taro farming taking place across Micronesia. These freshwater wetlands will experience increased salinization because sea level rise doesn't come just over the shoreline, it also comes up from below. And in 2007, 2008, there was a major king tide where we saw saltwater bubbling up through taro wetlands, saltwater bubbling up in atoll freshwater lakes. And these were destroyed and have never recovered. And it led to the development of cement taro, where you lay down a cement slab, you put 3-foot high walls of cement around it, and you mulch a soil and you start growing mountain taro instead of wetland taro. Those are the sorts of adaptation steps that are needed for food security. But freshwater is a huge issue because drought is also hitting some of the southern portions of Micronesia. And much of Majuro is already, the freshwater is already really confined just to the catchment system there and not really coming out of the ground any longer. In building a new island, you can build an aquifer in there. I can envision, a plastic or some sort of buried cistern type of structure in which you can go back to storing rainfall, and catchment would feed into that. I think that's one example of how the current situation, which is really just hanging on by a thread in many locations, can actually be improved. And some of these, the concept of a new island or raised land might be an opportunity for improved medical facilities, which are badly needed. And some of these places might become medical destinations rather than the mainland. So again, it's about socioeconomic creativity here, as well as engineering and finding the funding. And again, green investment is really starting to take off. ESG, green investment writ large, is really accelerating rapidly. And there are companies that are interested in looking to the Pacific for opportunities.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hauger?
The only thing I would add to that is, if I were in a position of decision-making in a Micronesian country, I would focus on forming long-term relationships with research universities in the United States. Dr. Fletcher can probably speak more to that because the University of Hawaii is engaged in a number of such programs. But I'm sure that the possibilities are greater when if you've got 40,000 or 100,000 residents on an island or in a nation, you simply don't have the human resources to address the broad range of problems that are involved. You have to be selective. And that means to me, you've got to leverage other resources. And universities and research institutions are always looking for people who can help them bring in money. And if you go with requests to the National Science Foundation, for example, which is now forming a more applied science type of division, but if you're going to them for money and you can say, I'm teamed with the with Marshall Islands on this, I'm bringing this assistance to their university, I'm bringing this, taking use of their people, I'm providing this kind of mentorship, please fund my program. You're going to get a lot better off than if you go in with a proposal without it. You're going to be more competitive. So the opportunity arise, and I don't think short-term relationships are the healthiest. I think you want to look to build 5-10-year relationships at a minimum. But you've got to say the first step is in the first year, we're going to do this because the funding is in that kind of cycle. So that would be my recommendation. Really search out the opportunities for teaming midterm to long-term with U.S. research institutions.
Thank you so much.
Chip, what do you say to that? All right.
Great idea.
Okay.
He's already partnering. I'm going to
And
ask.
the Department of Defense will do that too. I'm not aware of all of the opportunities, but I know that the engineers and the J4 and Indo-PACOM and used to be the J9 and others also have funds available and are looking for partnering opportunities. I can't point you toward this source or that source, but I can tell you if you'll go searching, you'll find them.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and invite Tori to go ahead and ask her question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, great. So I know it was mentioned earlier how one of the big challenges is land ownership and land usage when implementing new technologies. And so I was kind of wondering, how do you think we could improve communication with these indigenous communities in implementing these technologies, or collaborating with them to develop these technologies?
Yeah, I think that, these problems are not going to be solved unless everybody comes to the table and everybody is willing to compromise. The situation is going to require landowners, tribal councils, legislators to all realize that they don't have a future unless there's a little bit of pain, a little bit of sacrifice, and a lot of compromise that everybody engages in. Now, not all personalities are inclined to do that. And that can be a bottleneck right there. Things can grind to a halt when someone who owns a key piece of land or has a key vote, for instance, simply does not see the future for whatever personal biases they have. So these are important areas where public outreach and education about climate change, the realities of sea level rise, the realities of drought, the realities of typhoons, public education and engagement on this is really critical and needs to have begun already and cannot end. People need to be reminded constantly that this is a reality, and that we cannot rest. Yep, thank you.
If Dr. Hauger, if you have nothing to add there, it's probably a good segue in terms of that communication. But in terms of broadening awareness and education, you can see the next question on our Q&A. The climate complexity chart by Dr. Hauger is an excellent chart to kind of stimulate specific and unified discussions, analysis and possible solutions. Could this be expanding as teaching material? Right? Would this be one of the ways to kind of elevate that discussion, keep it at the forefront, as you suggested? Dr. Fletcher, I'll let you start, Dr. Hauger.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you?
Your chart where you actually showed the complexity of climate change, where you showed a lot of the, the secondary and tertiary effects of a single, single influence or a single change. Could that be expanded? Could things like that be expanded as teaching materials or included in schools?
Yeah, got it. Sure they can. There's a danger in it that needs to be avoided. Well, in fact, I'm looking at the chat room, and Desmond says, sadly, in the case of the Marshall Islands, the studies on climate change is only exceeded by the number of speeches on climate change. And I think that is a perceptive and accurate comment. In fact, in preparation for this presentation, I pulled up the World Bank studies on the Marshall Islands and some of the other states, and I looked at it, I said, oh my God, how can I use this? It's just masses of data that are, if you spend hours and hours and hours, maybe you can pull something useful out of it. But if you're preparing for a 15-minute presentation that's meaningful, it's a challenge. And maybe you can't, even if you spend hours and hours and hours. So maybe the chart can be a guide or help in doing that. But have you ever seen there was a TED talk on it, the US chart on operations in Afghanistan? It's probably about 15 years old or something like that. It's the same kind of spaghetti diagram, causal loop diagram. It's got probably 1,000 entries on this one diagram and arrows going back and forth between all of them. And it's really very well done. And if you follow all the entries, you can understand it and you can see what it is they're talking about. But very few people are going to take the time to, plunder through all of that information. So I think that the chart I presented is good to show the concept of complexity, to get people thinking about it. But then if they want to address a specific issue, I think it can just be provide guidelines. It can ask, who do I have to talk with? Where can I start? What are some of the known unknowns that I have to take into account? And really, if you do it rigorously, what you have to do is draw such a chart, look at it, assess from the chart where the point you can make a difference is, and then go in and make some operation at that point, and then wait and observe what the response is and how the chart changes, and so on and so on and so forth. It's incremental, Karl Popper type of approaches to policy. So I think it's a good guidance. I think it's good conceptually. I think it's something that people who are unaware of complexity need to think about. Maybe it can be used for silo busting, but in terms of a methodology, I'm not so certain.
Thank you very much. All right. We appreciate your time. Oh, I have, let me see. Go ahead, Natalie. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I think I accidentally hit raise hand when I was clicking.
Oh, no worries. All right. Well, with that, if there are any other questions, you can drop them in the Q&A. I'd like to, thank you again, Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Hauger, for joining us. You'll see, some of the thank yous in the chat. Please, if you can, go ahead and offer a thank you to our speakers. You can go ahead and put that in the chat. I want to share a couple of other things real quick. First is, this is a part of a series, a webinar series, and our next one will be on April 20th. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Here we had Dr. Hauger and Dr. Fletcher. For our next one, we'll actually have climate change and states' rights. The case for the Marshall Islands, featuring Dr. Marco Girard from Columbia University and Benjamin Graham from the Marshall Islands. If you'd like, I'll go ahead and share this in the chat. This is actually where you can go ahead and register for that event, and you'll get reminders. All right. Yeah, again, I'm going to stick around just in case there are any other questions, but thank you again, Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Hauger, for your time. Everybody else, have a good rest of your Wednesday. If you're over here on the other side of the international date line, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.